So this morning, I just prayed about it, but this morning is going to be a little bit different. I want to tell you the story of David, and then we're going to look at the prayer that David prays after the story that I'm going to tell you. And so we don't have too much text that's going to be up on the screen. It's not a whole lot, but we've been getting a lot of questions that kind of go like this. Wouldn't it just be better for me? Wouldn't it just be easier? Wouldn't life just be more enjoyable if I didn't find myself between a rock and a hard place? Like, if God is so good and God is so big, why doesn't he just interact so that I don't find myself between difficult decisions? That would be simpler for me. And it's a great question. But here's what I'm convinced of, that the platform of your character is amplified through struggle. That your character is more on display in tough moments than it is in great moments. See, Satan and God had this weird conversation. It's recorded in the book of Job. It's like 40-something chapters that started with a conversation between God and Satan, where Satan is moving to and fro in the earth, and God calls him, and they have this discussion, and I don't know if it's like, he's FaceTiming or he's there or how everything works together, but Satan and God have a conversation where he says, God says, have you seen my servant Job? He's faithful and upright, more so than anybody else. And Satan says, of course he is. Of course he's faithful and upright. You've given him everything he ever wants. He's the richest man in the world. He's got a huge family, plenty of houses, plenty of land, plenty of livestock, plenty of crops. He's got everything. Why wouldn't he love you? Because you've just abundantly blessed him. And God says, that's not why he loves me, and that's not why he's faithful and upright. It's not just because he's been blessed. You can take some things away from him, but you can't touch him. And Satan goes, okay, great. And in one fell swoop, literally, it's an insane story you see in Job 1, that literally storms happen and things come, and one of his children is in a house, and the house falls down and collapses and kills everybody. And the servant runs and he sprints to Job and he goes, Job, I was just in the house of your daughter and the house fell down and everybody in the house died. And I'm the only one who's escaped. And I'm here to tell you. And while he's talking, another one runs in and says the same thing. And another one runs in and says the same thing. And another one runs in and says the same thing. And another one runs in and says the same thing. And Job finds himself like just at a loss for words, completely sorrowful. He's lost his family. He's lost a lot of his property. He's lost so much of what he has, and he finds himself mourning. But he doesn't denounce God, and he doesn't get angry. He just tries to figure it out. And then God says, see, I told you he was faithful and upright. And Satan goes, well, that's because you wouldn't let me touch him. And he says, all right, do what you will, but you can't kill him. And we get this picture of Job in the end of Job 1 and Job 2 where he's literally sitting and using broken pottery to scrape the boils off of his skin because he's so uncomfortable. Sitting in a heap of like ashes, mourning, which was a sign of mourning in that day. But he finds himself just mourning, and his friends come and sit with him, and for 7 days he doesn't say anything. But he never denounces God. And see, I think we learn more from Job about his character when he was going through something tough than if he was just being blessed. Being blessed, it's like, yeah, I expect you to say the right thing. God has blessed me. God's given me the right stuff. Like, it's real easy for me to give God credit in the moments where I know I'm supposed to give God credit and things have gone really well. Like, oh man, God spoke through that message. Great, I'm glad he did. I'm not going to take any credit for that. God moved, and that's real easy. The tougher times are when things are difficult. That's where my theology is actually tested. That's where my belief is actually tested a little bit and put to the test, because it's like now all of a sudden I find myself under fire, and I have to decide, is God really God to me, or is that just convenient in moments of success? See, David, what we find with David is something a little bit different. We've been looking at David finding himself between a rock and a hard place, and we're seeing pictures of his character and pictures of those things that are being amplified through the struggles that he's dealing with, and we find out that he really is a man after God's own heart. But this week we're going to look at David's sin and how David screws up, and we're going to talk about probably his most famous sin. It is his most famous sin. I don't really think it's much debate about that. It's one that's talked about often, but here's what David does. David is king. At this point, he's taken over the kingdom. Saul has been removed from the throne, and David's in charge. And his army's off at war, and the king should be off with the army, but he's not. And one night, David says, hey, I'm going to go out on the balcony. It's hot in Israel, and it's hot in this palace. I'm going to go out on the balcony and get some fresh air. And when he goes out there, he sees this woman on another rooftop bathing. Her name's Bathsheba. And he goes, she's hot. I want her. And he goes to a servant. He says, go get her for me. And the servant goes and gets Bathsheba, and they sleep together. And David thinks everything's good. That was fun. It was one night. It was enjoyable. And then she comes back with those two words that scare the crap out of every guy. I'm pregnant. And then David has to figure out what to do. So he goes, oh, you know what? You're married and you're pregnant, and so let's solve this problem. Let's call back Uriah, your husband. Let's get him back here. I'll bring him back. We'll bless him. We'll encourage him. He can sleep with you, and everybody's going to think, hopefully they don't do the math on this, that he's Uriah's. Well, Uriah comes back, and Uriah is honorable, and Uriah says, my men are off at war, and they can't be with their spouses. I'm not going to go be with mine, and he sleeps on his doorstep. He doesn't go in the house. And David's like, this is a problem. Because that's not the Immaculate Conception. This isn't going to work that way. I need him to sleep with his wife. So the next night they have a dinner, and he gets Uriah drunk, and he tries to get Uriah to go sleep with his wife, and he still doesn't do it. And so David's only solution at that point in his mind is he writes a note to the general of the army, and he says, send Uriah to the front line of the most battle-heavy place. And just as the war really gets going, and just as the battle really picks up, I want you to let all the other troops pull back. And he signs this note, and he seals it. And he says, Uriah, I want you to give this to your commander. And little does Uriah know that he's carrying his own death note. Uriah goes out to the battlefield, and he takes that note and he gives it to his person, and his commander follows his command, and they put Uriah up on the front lines, and everybody pulls back, and Uriah is killed, and David's gotten away with it. And now he's just the loving king and caring friend who takes in Bathsheba because she's mourning the loss of her husband, and everything seems to be fine. There's not really too much of an issue. I mean, David's got some things, but he's not been caught. And I'm convinced that at this moment, David's convinced that he's gotten away with it. Him and Bathsheba know, and that one servant, but really nobody else. But here's what I love about God. God loved David too much than to allow him to get away with sin and think it was okay. Like, we're about to look at how God punishes David, and you can go, that's a mean God. I don't buy it, because I think God does what he does with David to draw David back in. Because he loved him enough to call him on his sin. He loved him enough to expose the deepest parts of him. And say, we got to deal with that. We got to begin to work through that. And so God sends the prophet Nathan. And the way that in the Old Testament, the way that we see God move is through the prophets. He speaks to the prophet, and then the prophet speaks on behalf of God. And you couldn't just say you were a prophet. Like, I grew up in church world. I'm used to a lot of people saying, God told me to do this. And most of the time what it means is I feel like doing this, and I'm just attaching God to it. And I've watched a lot of pastors. I'll pick on them for a minute because we're pretty bad about this. And some say, God has told me we're going to be in a new building by next year. And then that doesn't come, and that doesn't happen. And so they just go, oh, well, whatever. Not a big deal. Well, prophets in the Old Testament couldn't just do that. Because if they ever gave false prophecy, the penalty was stoning. They were killed. So when you claimed things on behalf of God in the Old Testament, and then those things didn't actually come to be true, you were deemed a false prophet and you were murdered. We saw that with Elijah and the false prophets of Baal, and of Ashir, and you see this battle between Elijah and these prophets, and like 850 prophets are killed in one day because they're proven to be false prophets. And we go, that's so much bloodshed. And God can be awful, but that's not God being awful. That's God saying, listen. And that's a community saying, listen, if you're going to speak on behalf of God, you better be right. That's not something to play around with. We don't just get to speak on God's behalf and do it poorly, but Nathan is the prophet. And so Nathan is the prophet when David is leading, and Nathan's given the chance and the charge to go confront David on his sin. Can you imagine that moment? Because whether or not he's right or not, David still has the power to kill him. He still has the authority to say, I don't feel like listening to it, off with his head. So Nathan tries to get creative. How do I go to David and call David on his sin, hopefully not offending him, hopefully not getting myself killed, but exposing something that needs to be addressed? And so Nathan gets creative, and I love this. He begins to think about, who is David? Well, David started out as a shepherd. He cared for sheep. He knew sheep. He loved sheep. Let me go to David with a story. And so he goes to David, and he tells him this story. He says, David, king, there was a man, a very rich man in a town, who had loads of sheep and loads of animals and plenty of money, and he was well blessed and well encouraged, and he was doing fine. And then there was another guy in the same city who was poor, and he had one sheep. That was it. And he loved the sheep, and he cared for it. And he said literally the sheep would like drink from his cup and eat from his plate. There's some dog people in the room going, I know what you're talking about. And I think you guys are weird. All right? Like, I love dogs, but there's a certain level of like closeness I just don't want to have with an animal. In any case, he goes, this dude was close with the sheep. He was part of the family. He carried him to things. Like, the sheep had a great life, and it was the man's only sheep. Well, when the rich man was throwing a party and was having some friends in from out of town, he needed to prepare a lamb for the meal. And so instead of taking one of his own, he goes to the poor man's house and he takes his. And he sacrifices it, and or he doesn't sacrifice it, he cuts it up and he prepares a feast. And David, engaged in the story, understanding what's happening, I think even reminiscing for a moment about what it was like to spend time with the sheep. And not that David had plenty of sheep, but for David to be able to go, yep, I know what it's like. I was close to that one. And he says, yeah, the rich man came in and killed it because he didn't want to take something of his own. And David gets angry. It says that anger wells up inside him. He goes, that man deserves to die. And Nathan goes, you're the man. See, David, because that's not a story about sheep. That's a story about what you did with Bathsheba. God blessed you and gave you everything you could have ever wanted. And then Nathan says, and if you needed more, he would have given it to you. Because God is gracious and loving and full of blessing. But instead of appreciating what you had, you went and took what somebody else had. And I feel like that's the moment where David's like, oh crap. What else do you do? Because that's the moment where you've got to understand, like, I need to either face the music or I'm going to deny it. And here's the question I want to ask. Have you ever been around people who just deny the things that seem so evident? Have you ever been around people who, like, you talk to them and you have conversations and you begin to deal with them? Parents of middle schoolers and high schoolers, you should get what I'm talking about here. That, like, you have a conversation and what they relay back to you doesn't seem anywhere close to what you actually expected. It just seems to be one excuse after another. See, when I worked in youth ministry, I'd often talk with like middle schoolers and high schoolers, and it was like it would rack my brain because it was this issue. You have so much potential that you're wasting to worry about things that just don't matter. You have so much potential, but you're so focused on something that makes no difference. And even when you're caught, you find yourself denying it and running from it and making excuses about it. One of my favorite stories in this was a friend of mine was partying in high school and decided to take his sister's truck out. He didn't have his license, but he decided to take or a vehicle, and he decided to take his sister's truck to this party. So he goes to a party. It's a couple of neighborhoods over. It's not that far away. And he says, listen, I've been drinking way too much, and I can't drive this home. So he gets his friend to drive the truck back to his house because his friend feels like he's sober enough that he can do kind of like that closed eye trick and make his way back there and park the truck back in the driveway so that he doesn't get caught in the morning when his dad gets home. And so they have this great plan and everything seems to be working. The friend drops off the truck. There's no issues. The friend walks back. Everything seems to be good until the next morning. His dad goes to pull into the driveway and the truck's parked pretty much in the middle of the driveway. And so what is a driveway wide enough for 2 cars now is wide enough for about 1.5 because of where this car is parked. And so the dad says, hey, why'd you take your sister's truck? I didn't. Well, your sister's truck wasn't parked where it was parked and your sister's out of town. So your mom didn't take it and I didn't take it. And you're the only other one who could have taken it. What happened? Not me. And he gets home and sees where the truck is parked. And when he's telling me the story, we literally sat at Mission Barbecue a couple years ago, and he's telling me this story, and he goes, so basically my boy screwed me over. And I'm like, no, basically you took your sister's truck and went and got drunk at a party you should have never been at. That's on you, man. You got to own that. No, it's not. It's on my boy. We're not friends anymore. And I was just like, I'm literally sitting there scratching my head, like wanting to beat my head against the wall, like, you don't get it. You don't understand. You made a series of bad decisions and you have to own that. And he goes, nah, if my friend would have just parked the truck in the right place, none of this would have ever mattered. And I'd love to say that at Mission Barbecue I was able to convince him that he was wrong, but what the truth is I left. I wrapped up the meal because I knew I wasn't going to be able to convince him. And I wasn't going to spend an hour and a half trying. And he spent time in and out of jail, and he spent time in and out of one bad decision after another, and he's not hopeless. God can still do a redemptive work in his life, and I believe God is doing things in his life. But I don't think anything's ever going to change for him until he comes to the point where he's willing to say, I'm the guy who screwed it up. Until he's willing to look in the mirror and be real. But for every moment he spends running around worrying about things that just don't matter, he's missing out on the potential that God has for him. And it's funny, and we can laugh at his story, and we can all see it, but how many times do we live it? Because I do that all the time. I hate being caught in something. I hate being wrong. I'll literally argue just to be right. Like I'll argue around something. I'll waste so much time. I'll frustrate the heck out of my wife to the point that she gives up just so I didn't have to admit that I was wrong. And then ultimately I have to come back and say, I was wrong, and I'm sorry for being an idiot. It just gets worse. There's some people who have dealt with people like that. We understand it. But what do you do when you've been called on something? What do you do when you've been exposed? What do you do when you've screwed up and you know it? See, what we see with David is this. He says, I am the man. I'm that man. And I hope God's merciful. And I hope God moves. We're going to look at a prayer that he prays, but before we do that, one of the things that David says to Nathan is, whatever God does is just. See, I find it interesting that David hopes God's not as harsh as he is. Because David about that man said that man deserves to die. And I wonder if in that moment when Nathan goes, well, you're the guy, like Nathan goes, well, this is just kidding. He deserves to be slapped on the wrist. Now, he had already thrown out the judgment, but fortunately for David, God doesn't judge him as harshly as he judges him. And I wonder if sometimes we don't go to God because we judge ourselves more harshly than he does. See, we got people in our church who have like grace tattooed on them as a reminder that they deserve grace and that they can get grace from God, and that like they need to be reminded that they need to give themselves some grace, because I'm convinced there's nobody harder on you than you. An exercise we've done in the past, and something I'd encourage you to do if you really struggle with giving yourself grace, the things you say about yourself, I'd encourage you to write them down. I am so stupid. I am so fat. I am so lazy. I'm such a bad mom. I don't take care of this house well. I'm such a. Just write them down. And then make them into you statements. You're such a bad mom. You're such a bad kid. You're such a bad whatever. And there's something that's weird that happens in that. Because I did this with somebody recently, and we went through the I statements that they were struggling with, and we changed them into you statements, and then I just put it on this because she was a mom. I said, listen, I want you to imagine I'm talking to your son. And this is what I'm telling him. You're so stupid. You're so dumb. You're such a waste of time. You can't get anything right. You're just one mistake after another. In fact, I think you're a mistake. And she started crying, and she got angry. She goes, you can't talk about my kid that way. I said, that's how God feels about you. See, God's not pleased with you beating yourself up. And God's not pleased with you living with sin in secret. And God's not pleased with you just covering yourself in shame and devaluing yourself, because he's created you worthy of his son coming and dying for you. Did you deserve Jesus' death on the cross? Absolutely not. Are you worthy of it? Yes, because you're a creation of God and you're made in his image. See, that's Genesis 1:26 and 27. Let us make man in our image. That's what God said. You're an image bearer of the one true God. You have worth. And David finds himself guilty, but he doesn't cover himself in shame because he's willing to admit, I am the man. So I want you to imagine a mirror and looking in it. Are you willing to say, I am the man, or I am the woman? Or are you going to argue back and push back and resist and make excuses and talk about all the things that could have gone wrong, or all the things that could have been done differently, or all the things that are so much worse than what you are? See, because at the end of the day, here's what I want you to get. There's nobody else in the mirror. You don't get to I'm not holding the mirror up here and you can sit on the front row and go, oh, I know what that person did in the back row. They're so much worse than me. That's why they're sitting in the back row. That person came hungover to church. That person had sex last night. That person did blah, 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 blah. I can go through all the list. And so I'm not that bad because I just told one small lie. But the problem is there's nobody else in the mirror. It's us compared to Jesus. It's us compared to perfection. Did you do it or did you not? Am I the man that fell short of what God wanted for me? Yes. See, David admits that he's the man, and Nathan says, here's what's going to happen. The son that she's having is going to die. He's not going to make it. He'll be alive for 7 days, and that's it. The son's born. And David petitions God and fasts and prays and mourns, covers himself in ashes, very similar to what we saw with Job, because that was the way to mourn back then. It was a sign of mourning. And after 7 days, the son dies, and his servants go, if this is how he mourned before his son's death, what is he going to do now? David gets up and worships. And goes and has a meal and says, I need to be restored. And the servants say, there's a problem here, David. What you mourned before your son was gone. And he said, I was petitioning God. But God answered. And even though I don't like it, he's still God and worthy of my praise. And his judgment is not unfair because he's a just God. And then David has other family issues and all kinds of stuff. And there are consequences that just kind of continue to roll out of some of the bad decisions that David's made. And you go, then what's the point of looking in the mirror and admitting to be the man? Admitting to be the man doesn't get rid of the consequences. It gets rid of the condemnation. And that's huge. Because David's got some weight on his shoulders of being a father and of being a husband. But he doesn't have the weight of his shame on his shoulders because he understands that God's already taken that from him. And so I want to encourage you. If you go, I get it, I'm the man or I'm the woman, admit it. Get real before God. We talked about this last week, to allow God into the deepest parts of you. God, I am that person. I did have that affair. I did look at that porn. I did mess up that relationship. I didn't work hard enough in that marriage. I did fail that test because I didn't study. I did bomb that performance because I didn't practice enough. I did do those drugs. I did avoid that rehab. I did run out of that place when I knew I should be there. I did run to that relationship and take it way too far. Admit that. Allow God into that. Because what you experience on the other side is not the lack of consequences, it's the lack of condemnation. It's freedom. If you had sex before married and you had a kid, that kid doesn't disappear when you repent. But the guilt you carry can. Because Jesus has already paid that. And there's some people in the room who go, yeah, but I don't deserve grace. And so I'm not gonna go to God because his grace doesn't even make any sense. And I don't deserve that. I deserve far worse than that. And while that might be true, I think you're just punishing yourself pointlessly. You're being harder on yourself than the God of the universe is on you. When David finds himself in this place, he admits to being the man. But we also talked about David in the past few weeks being a poet and writing and working through some of his things. And he wrote Psalm 51. And Psalm 51, like the pretext to it is, this is a psalm of David written after Nathan confronted him about sleeping with Bathsheba and killing Uriah. And we're going to look at it in the Message translation. And real quick, I'm just doing this like a quick sidebar. If you guys are like translation people, I want to teach you something real quick. So if you hang around Christians long enough, they'll start asking you, what translation of the Bible do you read? It's a lame question. Don't really worry about it, all right? But there's three different translations, or there's a lot of translations. There's three different ways to translate Scripture. One is word for word. So you take the Greek word or the Hebrew word that it was originally written in, you figure out what the closest English word to that is, and you translate it. And then you put it just in the sentence that way, word for word translation. And then there's kind of like phrase for phrase. This is like New Living Translation. And they basically take like the phrase and they want to put that phrase correctly into what it is. And then there's like concept for concept. So almost like paragraph for paragraph. They get the general meaning, they get the detail of it, and they want to put it in there. And there's some debate among Christian theologians and really novice theologians about, well, word for word has to be best. Well, ideas are better. And they kind of debate things that nobody really cares about. And that's why I'm not a theology major. In any case, what we know is this. That it's helpful at times to understand word for word, but it's helpful at times to understand concept for concept. And so we don't compromise Scripture. But I used to live in a camp that said word for word has to be best because it's closest to that. That's only true in languages that come out of Greek and Hebrew. You can't take that to like an African tribal language and apply it because there is no word for the word that you've created. There is no translation out of Hebrew into an African tribal language. And so it's already off. You've just got to get the concepts. But when it comes to things like the Psalms, even the most conservative word-for-word translations go to a phrase-for-phrase idea. Because they understand that the Psalms were poetic. And at times they rhymed. And at times they were artistic. And you can't capture that in just word-for-word translation from Greek or Hebrew to English. And so David writes this in Hebrew, and he writes it very, very poetically. We're going to look at it in the Message because I think the Message is one of those concept-for-concept translations is much more easy to understand and much more true to what David is actually crying out. Here's what he says, generous in love, God give me grace. Huge in mercy, wipe out my bad record. Scrub away my guilt, soak out my sins in your laundry like I'm a stain on what you had that was clean. I know how bad I've been. My sins are staring me down. See, that's how I feel when I look in the mirror at times. Because you might not see what I see in my eyes, but I see my soul when I look into my eyes. And he says, God, you're the one that I've violated. And you've seen it all. You've seen the full extent of my evil. You have all the facts before you. And whatever you decide about me is fair. God, you could kill me and it's still just. That's the justice I thought I deserved. I've been out of step with you for a long time, in the wrong since before I was born. What you're after is truth from the inside of me out. So enter me, conceive a new, true life. Soak me in your laundry, I'll come out clean. Scrub me, and I'll have a snow white life, not like a fairy tale life. Although I did think it was kind of funny that was written that way. I love the way he puts this. Tune me into the foot-tapping songs. Set these once broken bones to dancing. Don't look too close for blemishes, but give me a clean bill of health. God, make a fresh start. Shape a Genesis week, a creation week from the chaos of my life. Don't throw me out with the trash or fail to breathe holiness in me. Bring me back from the gray exile and put a fresh wind in my sails. See, I think this morning there's some of us that need to understand if we can get to the point, I am the man or I am the woman, we get a fresh wind in our sails. Life. Able to take a deeper breath than maybe we were able to take when we walked in the door because we're carrying a little bit less weight. And then he says, give me a job of teaching rebels your ways so that the lost can find their way home. Commute my death sentence, my God, and my salvation, God. I'll sing your anthems to your life-giving ways. Unbutton my lips, and I'll let loose with your praise. Going through the motions doesn't please you. A flawless performance is nothing to you. I need that in my life. A reminder that a flawless performance is not what God's after. But that God worship starts when my pride was shattered and heart-shattered lives ready for love don't for a moment escape God's notice. That God pays attention to the broken and to the hurting. Make Zion the place you delight in. Repair Jerusalem's broken down walls, and then you'll get real worship from us. Acts of worship, small and large, including all the boils. That'd be weird. All the bowls that they can heave on the altar. Basically, everything that we could give you would be an act of worship if our heart's in the right place. But nothing we can give you will ever be an act of worship if our heart's off. Guys, it's something to be able to come in here and sing some songs, but if our heart's in the wrong place, none of this really matters. Singing lyrics is nothing more than like Christian karaoke without the drinks, because we're Christian. I don't know where I was going with that, but it made people laugh. But the idea is this, that like it's meaningless. It's not worship. When we come in and we run to God and we go, oh, I want to praise you. Oh, standing. And we sing our song and we clap our hands and we enjoy it, but we don't have any sort of like openness to God actually moving in our situation. We're singing nothing but vain words. See, I believe David is a worship leader. Not because he was so talented with music, but because he kept his heart in the right place. Did he screw up? Absolutely. Was it a series of bad decisions? Yeah. Let me tell you about the series of bad decisions he makes before he ever even sleeps with Bathsheba. David's rooftop was higher than most people's in the cities, which means when David walked out at night, he knew he'd be seeing some people bathe. It was not unusual for women to bathe on their rooftops. They had tubs up on the rooftop because they didn't have heated water. And so if they wanted to take a warm bath, they'd draw it in the morning, they'd let it heat up throughout the day, and then they'd go lay in it at night. And so when David wanders his way out onto the balcony, I don't think he's just trying to look over the city. I think he's trying to check out what's there. The same way we can sit down at a computer or pull out our phone. He's bored. And he goes and checks out something that he knows he shouldn't. And then while doing that, he acts on it and he goes, I want that one. and then he sleeps with her. I think it starts even before that. David had a responsibility to lead an army, and he was giving up his responsibility. He was being passive as a leader, which led to his passivity as a follower of God later. See, it's rooted in much deeper things, and it starts way earlier than we think. And isn't it interesting that as we think about our lives and the things that we're so scared to admit and look in that mirror and go, I'm that man or I'm that woman, isn't it interesting that we can look back and go, they didn't start there? See, nobody woke up this morning and go, I hope I'm a drug addict today. Nobody's planning a marriage going, I hope my second marriage is better. I mean, unless you're planning your second marriage. But nobody's engaged in their first engagement and first marriage saying, I hope my second marriage turns out better than this one. And if that's you, there's something off. Like, we need to talk. Nobody goes, I hope I ruin my kids. I hope I raise criminals and failures and kids that hate God and their parents. Nobody sleeps with a guy and says, I hope I get pregnant and raise this kid fatherless. Nobody wishes for bankruptcy and financial trouble. Those things come as a series of decisions and events in our lives. Moments where we find ourselves between rock and a hard place, big or small, and we begin to make decisions about it. And those are the moments where our character is tested. And it may not even be revealed in that moment that we don't have character, but eventually it will be revealed, not because God's mad at you, but because God loves you enough to not let you get away with it. Because he gives you forgiveness, and he gives you grace, and he gives you mercy. If you're willing to come to him and say, I'm that guy, or I'm that woman. So this morning, I don't know what your thing is, but you do. I'm not convinced there's anybody really sitting in the room going, I don't really have a thing I need to deal with. I don't have sin that I've ever struggled with. I'm actually perfect. But I'd encourage you to deal with that thing. Get in front of the mirror today. Get in your car and look at your phone. Put it on camera and like you're going to take a selfie and just have that conversation. I'm that man. I'm that woman. And I got some things to deal with. And invite God into that process, because I believe on the other side of it there's freedom. Not from all the consequences, because that's just the result of our own action, but from the condemnation. There's forgiveness and there's healing. And so the band's going to come back up. We got a couple songs that we're going to do. I've given the band a lot of freedom over the past couple of months to just say, hey, we're not like stuck in this 3 songs, a host spot, a message, and 1 song. We don't have to be in like a routine. We get to be creative. We want to engage our right side of our brain and the left side. So we do logical system things, but we also do a lot of creative things. And so we've given them some creativity. And the band over the past couple of weeks has done 2 songs at the end and 2 songs at the beginning. And it gives us a chance to do communion. So they're going to be passing out communion. It's just a reminder that God steps into our mess and provides hope and provides freedom when we're willing to be real with him. But the band's going to do 2 songs. The first one, I'd encourage you just to sit and listen and reflect. You can stand as you feel comfortable and take communion. And then the second song we're all going to sing together is kind of like our charge as we walk out of here. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of Element. I want to remind you that as we get ready for next week, I've invited anybody who wants to be here at 9 o'clock next week. We got some big announcements and some big things going on as a church, and I want to bring you into that and let you be part of that discussion. And so we'd love for you to be here at 9. We're going to do a quick time of worship, and I'm going to share some things about what God's laying on our heart as a church. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you that you're gracious and loving. And God, I thank you that you're faithful. That your word doesn't come back void, that you're not unable to forgive us, that your sacrifice isn't going to be enough for our sin. God, you can cover anything we've ever done. You covered David, who you blessed to be king, but chose to be a murderer and an adulterer. And if that's what he did and that's what you've done in his life, I'm confident you can do it in ours. And so, God, I pray that you would move and that you would speak, and that you give us the boldness to come before you and admit that we're the guy or we're the lady that needs your grace. It's in your name I pray. Amen.